Good morning, grade 8s. Just going to go through the chapter 16 PowerPoint with you guys today. So, chapter 16 is called Return to Roots, and that is because it takes place after all these changes that we saw were starting to occur after during the Meiji period, after the fall of the shogun. And now we're going to see what happens after that period once all those changes took effect. So what was going on after the time is we saw they had Japan brought in the five charter oath, along with various other changes to their society, and they borrowed many things from European and American culture, and we're going to see what effect this had on Japanese culture. So the Japanese who visited America and other Western countries studied the construction of their houses and examines their furniture such as sofas, mirrors, uh, china, cutlery, things like that, and they tried to recreate Western rooms inside of their house. This is just one example of the various things that the Japanese started to bring in, because once the floodgates were opened of connection to the West, or contact with the West, we start to see Western culture, Western goods, Western things start to come into society, Japanese society. So, um, in Japan, many changes took place in a short space of time. Many people of all social classes were open to new ideas. So we start to see a whole bunch of influence on Japanese culture from the West. So we start to see the wealthy buying Western clothing, the poor who weren't able to afford such clothes still accepted Western ideas, such as a village constitution to promote Western political ideas and democracy. Um, However, with all these new things, there is still a large portion of Japanese society that still want to keep Japanese culture intact. So they are seen to have a conservative view of their traditional ways. So what we see is we start to see a march towards what is called westernization, or you taking on the technology of like Western Europe or the United States. So westernization is an adoption of Western ways and ideas. So the motto for this period you can see as civilization and enlightenment. The Meiji government officials wanted to change the unequal treaties with the Western countries. They felt the way to do this was win respect for Japan by showing it was a modern, civilized country. And remember, I say civilized in quotation marks because we know that there is more than one way to be civilized. They also thought it would make Japan stronger and more competitive with the Western powers. Um, Westerners in the mid 1800s who came to Japan were not often tolerant of the traditional Japanese cultures, just like we saw with basically with in chapter 5 and 6 with exploration and colonization. A lot of Western people would see people who were not from Europe or from European descent, so i.e. not white, and they saw them as being more barbaric and more barbarians, and so they often treated them as unequals. And this was the same thing in Japan. They saw the Japanese as being a lower society, a lower civilization. So they saw it as being less civilized. So the Japanese government, because they wanted the West to respect them and they wanted to be on equal footing as the rest, they started outlawing behavior that they deemed to be offensive to foreigners. One such thing was in warm weather, Japanese men would work only in loincloths because if it's hot and humid, you're not going to want to wear full European or dress or just a full dress. You want to be comfortable working in hot, humid climate. Um, so they ended up banning this practice because when European women complained that there was a lack of respectable clothing, a popular governor in Japan, ordered all laborers and boatmen to wear a shirt or tunic properly clothed. So you can see how, even though it's not practical, that a lot of the Japanese wanted to match up to what they saw as European standards. In 1872, the Japanese government passed any law to prohibit tattooing, such as the one done by any of the Ainu who are still left, and many samurai had tattoos. So what we're starting to see in this is Western influence on the government of Japan, making it almost making starting to make things important aspects in Japanese culture almost illegal. Public bathing, an essential Japanese ritual, shocked proper Victorians, i.e., Victorians living during the British people living during the time of Queen Victoria. And so what this even did is they ended up closing the public's baths or for them to be modified. And once again, this is a Japanese traditional ritual that is being shut down because of Japan's attempt to westernize. So they also encourage Japanese people to get rid of traditional clothing and start to dress in more like the West. So the government urged Japanese men to abandon their kimonos for trousers, suits, and coats. In 1870s, all prominent Japanese, including the emperor, started to wear their hair cut short. No longer did they have the long hair. Some grew beards and mustaches, and the Japanese military were ordered to wear Western-style uniforms. The uniforms of police and train conductors were also changed to the West. So once again, another area of Japanese culture that is being eroded in order to keep the West happy or to maybe appear a little more like the West, so the Japanese Jap would be taken seriously by the West. Um, so this is all happening, and we start to see um, a lot of people becoming westernized. And so Western culture becomes very popular. And this is especially with the younger generations because they're the generations who see these new goods, this new technology, and they want that. Much like you guys, when new technology comes out, many of you want to go out and get it. Or when new clothing styles or new shoes or new anything come out, there's a push, especially by the younger generations, to have it. However, there is a backlash to this. So many traditional people in Japan, especially sort of the older generations, start to worry about this and start to worry about this loss of Japanese culture. So many Japanese thought their society was going too far with westernization, especially after the government built what is called the Deer Cry Pavilion. The Deer Cry Pavilion was a fancy European style building in which the Westerner visitors were entertained. There was long buffets with European food. And we would see things such as Japanese puffing on Cuban cigars, playing pool and billiards, listening to French orchestras, German polkas and waltzes. And the Japanese just so because of a backlash to this, the Japanese decided to close the pavilion, and a backlash, which is a hostile reaction to a trend, was setting off against Westernization. Um, there are various different changes that upset the Japanese, such as many Japanese did not eat meat. Strict Buddhism forbade it, forbade the killing and eating of animals. However, because of this westernization, meat began to be introduced to the Japanese diet. And in fact, the Meiji government encouraged it because they saw it as a way to sort of get more protein in Japanese diet. And once again, when Westerners would visit, they would want meat. They wouldn't want to stick with just the normal rice and fish. We also see once again with the Japanese samurai wearing their top knot. Westernization thought top knots were too primitive, and the Japanese were pressured into getting haircuts. So we see this backlash, and it's all stems from the fact that the Japanese felt like they were losing their culture. So they felt that people were being made to feel embarrassed about their Japanese traditions and their way of lives, and they thought that their culture was being altered and too much was being borrowed from the West. The rapid change had made tensions and had made sorry the rapid change made tensions in Japanese society, and the Japanese, because they were a proud independent people, they many of the older generations worried about losing this because their culture, once again, one of the main reasons why Japan cut itself off was to preserve their culture. So their customs and beliefs are important to them. So So they saw this time of adaptation to the West uh, as important because they needed the technology from the West, but they also wanted to preserve their culture. So we start to see the motto changing of this time, changing from civilization and enlightenment to this idea of Western science, Japanese essence. And I think that motto is very important because it shows what Japan wants to accomplish in this period of time. It shows that they want to have Western science, so they want to have the Western technology, they want to have the weapons, they want to have the steam engines, they want to have everything that the West has. However, they still want to maintain what is important in Japanese culture and what makes them Japanese. Um, so under this time, we see Japan once again the new solidifying their constitution. So they make the new constitution makes the emperor's powers sacred and inviolable, meaning that it can never be challenged or dishonored. The Japanese were given things such as freedom of speech and freedom of religion, so no longer is Christianity outlawed. In fact, we start to see a rise in Japanese Christians, and we start, and this is part because once they stop banning it and once they allow the West in, we start to see missionaries coming back in and starting to convert Japanese people to Christianity. Um, we start to see a right to private property, we right to being able to move around the country, and you start to see the beginning of what are called legal rights. Um, we start to see an actual government that sits called which is called a diet, which it has a House of Peers, which is the nobility, and a House of Representatives, which is made up of representation of the people. So this is exactly like the House of Lords and the House of Commons in Britain. That is like our Senate in Canada and our Parliament buildings, our House of Commons in Ottawa. So we start to see a bit of a more of a Western style of government. So this is all part of trying to make Japanese strong and Japan a strong country. And one of the reasons why this is the Japanese still remember what it was like to have Matthew Perry come land in Japan and realize they are completely outmatched by the West. They realized that they realized that this is why they were forced to sign the unequal treaties, and they realized that if they ever want to have a chance of protecting Japanese culture and protecting Japan, they have to see what makes the West powerful. They have to see how that the West was able to grow and how they are able to basically control the majority of the world. And when the Meiji leaders look at the West, they come up with three lessons and three things that the Japanese must do in order to become a powerful country and ensure that they will never have to be forced to sign anything again. And they are as followed: control over foreign countries or territories. So they realize that all these Western countries that are strong, they have foreign colonies, they have foreign territories through that were obtained through the process of colonization. They have military to defend. They have military power to defend their territories, and they all have a strong and independent economy. Is that these economies, well, not being isolated and getting things from out of the all throughout the world, they still are independent and they have sole control over the economy. When the Meiji leaders realize this, they have none of these three things. And so we are going to see the Japanese go through a transformation in order to have these different these three things so Japan can become not only a strong country, but as we're going to see, a very strong emperor. I mean, a strong empire, not empire. The Japanese government began to strengthen its military. They realized this because they saw that this would allow Japan to gain territory and influence in Asia. It would also be able to protect itself from Western aggression, as well from its closest neighbors, China and Russia. So Japan comes up with its next motto, and they start moving towards being a wealthy country with a strong army. Um, so Japan begins to industrialize at a rapid rate. They start to realize, they start to use this sort of stoic culture of Japan in order to strengthen their military, in order to industrialize at a very rapid rate. So they come up with what is called the Conscription Law of 1873, which requires that all males serve in the military for 3 years and then do a reserve duty for another 4 years. And what this does is it makes Japan have a permanent army. No longer do the daimyo or lords have to negotiate to raise an army. It does not, the shogun, or I should say the emperor, does not have to ask people to serve for them. And when you have a constant army, you can continuously train that army and make it a good army. So they start to do this, they start to industrialize, and they very quickly have a good navy. They look at Prussia and they mimic the Prussian style of army, which is the best army in the world, and they start to industrialize very quickly. And in the span of about 30 or 40 years, Japan has a very good army. They have a very strong economy and they industrialize. And then the next step they look at is they look for outwards to find territory that they can conquer. And we're going to see this a little bit later in this PowerPoint, that they do just that. They start reaching out. They go to Korea. They go to other Asian countries. And they try to start getting colonies. So some Japanese thinkers are not pleased with the process of adopting, um, uh, but they do this very quickly, but it's not without some backlash, as some Japanese thinkers were not pleased with the process of adapting Western ways, regardless of the benefits of this technology and military power. They were disturbed by Japan's political and education system, and they were worried that Japan was starting to become more authoritarian again, with the emperor getting more and more power, and in fact, almost becoming his a god himself. They argued that modern peace-loving civilizations became prosperous by giving their citizens freedoms and rights and democracy, not taking it away. They criticized the Meiji regime, not the emperor, however, for paying too much attention to military and war, and they worried that Japan was trying to become a powerful state rather than a civilized society. So this militarization and imperialism that began during the Meiji era led to Japan's involvement in World War II and eventually its defeat in 1945 with the dropping of atomic bombs. And at the end of this PowerPoint, I will give you a little bit of information about how this occurs, because the path that starts with in the late 1800s puts Japan on a crash course with the United States and getting involved in World War II. But it's important to note, and it's important to see with this sort of this rapid industrialization, this is very unique to Japan, because for industrialization with the United States, with Britain, with all of Europe, it takes them a long time. But Japan does this so quick, and my argument is because of that stoic characteristic that we talked about when we started looking at Japan, is that they realize that this industrialization is going to hurt. It's going to be hard. It's going to be very difficult, and it's going to require a lot of sacrifice. But part of Japanese identity is to be able to do this. Because once again, when a disaster hits Japan and crushes society, they mourn, they pick up their things, and they rebuild. So this is a very interesting quote that I really like, and it sort of talks about how fast and how unique Japan is in this case. Is the term miracle has been applied to Westerners more than once to Japan's modern history. It has been used to describe its achievements in Meiji, when just half a century Japan developed from an obscure, isolated land of rice paddy fields and to a major imperial power. It was used again just a few decades later to describe the nation nations even more rapid post-war after World War II rise from the ashes of defeat to become, by some measure, the wealthiest country on the planet, and by any measure, a huge economic superpower. So I really like this because it talks about it. Not only once does Japan do this, going from a backwater sort of untechnological country to becoming a industrial and economic powerhouse. The first time from going from sort of feudal Japan to the Japanese Empire, but then also after it is completely crushed after World War II to being one of the most modern technologically advanced nations. So, in modern times, Japan management practices, the Japanese case study is studied again and again to see how this happens. So, what I would like to do now is, if you give me a little, if you give me a second, I'm going to pull up another PowerPoint. And I want to talk about sort of this process of going after Japan industrialized its ability to not only stand up to the West, but also to build an empire. So give me 2 seconds. I'm just going to pull it up right now. Where is it? It's going to look very similar to this. And we're going to look at the Japanese at war. So we saw that. Where is it? We saw that the Japanese government had found out three things with regards to being able to stand up to the West. And they realized that they needed control over foreign colonies or territories, they needed military power to defend its territories, and they needed a strong, independent economy. So Japan does this, and then we're going to look at this process of how Japan builds its empire and it gains these colonies. So the first way they do this is what is called through the Sino-Japanese War, which is a war between China and Japan. So the first Sino-Japanese War was fought between the Qing Empire and the Empire of Japan, primarily over the influence of Korea the influence over Korea. After more than 6 months of unbroken successes by the Japanese land and naval forces and the loss of Port Waiwei, the Qing government sued for peace in February 1895. So Japan goes to war with China over a piece of Korea in order to have a port and access to China, the Chinese market, and the sort of powers through China. Is they fight a war and Japan wins it very quickly. And once they win this, they realize that they are able to build an empire. So to do this, Japan Japan wants to start building its empire. So it turns its eyes towards Korea. Korea has been trying to do what Japan did and isolate itself from foreign influence. And they try to exclude foreigners, refusing embassies from foreign countries and firing on ships anytime they come near its shore. At the start of the war, Japan had the benefit of three decades of reform, leaving Korea outdated and vulnerable. As a newly risen power, Japan turns its attention towards Korea and wants to ensure that they are the ones who can take Korea, not China, not any other country. And they want to block any other power from annexing or dominating Korea. So annexing means taking over. And they want so they look at taking in Korea as part of their empire. Korea had traditionally been a tributary state of China, so that means that they were sort of controlled by China. Um, However, a lot of people in Korea were not happy with being under Chinese control. So opinion in Korea itself was split. Conservatives wanted to remain under Chinese control, while reformists wanted to approach Japan and some of the Western nations because they saw the rapid change in Japan. So they thought this would be a good thing. After fighting two opening wars against the British, um, The China was unable to resist the encroachments of Western powers. Japan saw an opportunity after these two wars were fought, so they decided that they would turn their eyes to Korea and take their opportunity. Due to the lack, so they basically invade Korea. Due to the lack of the modernization of the Chinese armor, the war is over quickly. China gave up its claim to Korea, and Japan won the island of Taiwan. Japanese victory worried the Western powers because they did it so quickly, and Korea is right by Russia. So they step in and they broker a peace. So what they do is they basically force Japan, even though they won the war, to give up territory it had won. And this is going to be important because this is going to lead to what is called the Russo-Japanese War, which is a war between Japanese and Russia. The Russo-Japanese War is fought between the Russian Empire and Japan over Japan's imperialistic ambitions in Manchuria and Korea. Russia, who wanted a warm water port on the Pacific Ocean for its navy and its maritime trade, turned its eyes what is called an area called Vladivostok, which is was sorry um, they had Vladivostok, which was its only warm water port, Russia's only warm water port on the eastern side of its country. So they wanted to expand and find another base. And to do this, they looked at what is called the Liaodong province, which was and they leased it from China, which means they paid rent for it, and it was allowed them to have a port that was operational all year. Since the end of the First Sino-Japanese War, Japan feared this Russian encroachment, and because that it was rented out to Russia, Japan saw this as a threat. Seeing Russia as a rival, Japan offered to recognize Russian dominance in Manchuria in exchange for recognition of Korea being under the influence of Japan. They said, you can have Manchuria, you can have this warm water port that you wanted as long as you allow us to sort of control Korea. Russia refused this and demanded that they be able to control they be able to control parts close to Korea, and Russia demanded that North Korea, so anything above the 39th parallel, sort of be seen as this neutral buffer zone where Japan has no control over in order to be a buffer between Russia and Korea. The Japanese government perceived a Russian threat to its plans for expansion into Asia and chose to refuse that and go to war. After negotiations broke down in 1904, the Japanese Navy opened up hostilities by attacking a Russian fleet at Port Arthur, China, in a surprise attack. Russia suffered multiple defeats by Japan, but Tsar Nicholas II was convinced that Russia was win because they saw that Russia is a European country, and they saw themselves as superior to Japan. They saw, how can this small Asian country defeat us? Um, it was they were so they decided, instead of trying to resolve the peace, they decided to continue fighting, and they decided that so Japan and Russia continued this war at first to and what basically happens is Japan wipes the floor with Russia. They beat them outright and they beat them quickly. The war concluded with what is called the Treaty of Portsmouth, and it was mediated by Theodore Roosevelt, the President of the United States. The complete victory of the Japanese surprised the world. This was the first time ever that a non European country beat a European country. The conquest transformed the balance of power in East Asia. Basically, it resulted in a reassessment of the power of Japan, and ultimately it turned Japan into an empire and turned them into a world power. And it made all European countries take note. So the militarization and the imperialism that began at this period eventually led to Japan's involvement in World War II. And how do we get from here? Which is from Japan taking basically one country to becoming a threat to the United States. And I'm going to now quickly go over how this occurred. Um, and basically, what happens is Japan looks looks at the West, and they realize that once again, if they want to be able to stand up to the West, they need to build an empire. So ends up happening is Japan starts to continuously expand its empire. It takes Korea, it takes parts of China, it takes parts of Vietnam, and it starts expanding its sphere of influence. And what eventually happens is Japan, because it is that such a small country, they very quickly realize as they continuously expand their empire, they realize they are going to run out of resources. So they start going close, encroaching more and more and more on the United States territory. What eventually happens is the United States uh, starts to really take the Japanese threat seriously. So what they do is they put what is called an oil embargo on Japan, meaning they start to cut off Japan's access to oil. So without oil, the Japanese do not have a way to fuel all their technology, it does not have a way to fuel their empire does not have a way to outfit their military with all the technology they need to keep their empire. So Japan realizes at a very early moment after this embargo that they are on a collision course to war with the United States. Because once again, the United States has territories in the Philippines, it has bases in the Philippines and all throughout Asia as well. So what happens is Japan then realizes they cannot defeat the United States. However, if they act quickly and under surprise, they might be able to to surprise the United States, and then eventually and basically, using that defeat, they hope that they can come up with a treaty to sign with the United States, which will then keep the United States out of its business. So what they realize is the United States keeps its entire Pacific fleet of its navy, so all its ships, all its gunboats, all its weaponry in Hawaii at a place called Pearl Harbor. And what the Japanese decide to do is that if they can attack Pearl Harbor under surprise and take out the Pacific fleet, they might be able to have a quick end to a war with the United States. They know they can't win, but if they can knock out enough ships, they can they can they hope they can come up with sort of a treaty with the United States and have a quick ending to the war. So the Japanese in December they decide they will wage war. They will attack Pearl Harbor. So the Japanese do this. They surprise the United States. They have a very successful attack on Pearl Harbor. It's the first time that any nation has attacked the United States, and they do end up sinking a lot of American warboats. However, what the Japanese did not realize is that many of the boats that the Navy has are actually out on an exercise at this time, and they do not take out enough ships. So, meaning the United States is still able to fight in the Pacific. And instead of having a quick victory and then having a quick peace treaty, Japan then enters the World War II, and we see a very bloody, very violent war in the Pacific against Japan that takes a lot of American lives, a lot of Canadian lives, a lot of Japanese lives, and a lot of Chinese lives, and eventually leads to the two atomic bombs being dropped on Japan. So after that, they are defeated, and then Japan then becomes almost like an American colony, but then eventually is the poster child of how you go from a defeated country to a technological powerhouse in a very short amount of time. But that is outside of our scope, and that is the end of our Japanese unit. I hope you guys listen to this, and if you have any questions, please reach out and talk to me. You guys can now use this as the for the chapter 16 questions, and have a great day. I'll talk to you next time when we start looking at the Aztecs.